why are we here? Or can I have a relationship with God? These kinds of things I can't measure with my microscope or my telescope.
Hope deranges us. Hope breaks things and breaks things down.
Christianity isn't some kind of self-help doctrine. It's not probiotics for the soul or something, you know?
He was using the parable of the Good Samaritan to justify bombing Syria.
Hi, I'm Simon Smart.
And I'm Natasha Moore.
Welcome to Life and Faith.
I'm sorry, a white middle-class man like you does have it. Try being disabled, try being an asylum seeker, try being gay, try being a woman. You'll find it's not there.
So I said we give him the last word.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what you would say.
At spending money, look at the VA. No, because it is dangerous.
I just told you several countries that do it.
But I'm sorry.
Hold on a minute.
Hold on, everybody. God bless you all.
Well, there's some strong disagreement there. And it's really the sort of thing we're getting used to today. Politics is so gridlocked, public discourse so toxic. People feeling under threat retreat into their tribes and shoot arrows at their enemies, real or imagined.
And of course, it almost goes without saying that this is all amplified online. Places like Facebook and Twitter can become very stressful and toxic places to be, and we go very easily to contempt and to outrage. We almost, want to pounce on each other, want to look for things to disagree with and to get outraged at each other about.
And I know I get into trouble about this, but that's one of the reasons why I'm a little bit averse to these platforms.
Instagram is the place for you, Simon.
Okay. There was an in-depth article a couple of years ago in The New Yorker by the writer George Saunders, considering this state of tribalism, especially in America, and how concerning it is. Now, I want to read you a little bit of this. Now, stick with me. It's long, but I really think it's worth it. This is what George Saunders says. Intellectually and emotionally weakened by years of steadily degraded public discourse, we are now two separate ideological countries, left land and right land, speaking different languages, the lines between us down. Not only do our two sub-countries reason differently, they draw upon non-intersecting data sets and access entirely different mythological systems. You and I approach a castle. One of us has watched only Monty Python and the Holy Grail, and the other only Game of Thrones. What is the meaning to the collective we of yon castle? We have no common basis from which to discuss it. In the old days, a Liberal and a Conservative got their data from one of three nightly news programs, a local paper and a handful of national magazines, and were thus starting with the same basic facts. Now, each of us constructs a custom informational universe. The data we get this way, pre-imprinted with spin and mythos, are intensely one-dimensional.
Wow. Well, that's kind of depressing. Though I must say that partly because his writing is so brilliant and he references Monty Python and he uses data as a plural noun, it kind of makes me not despair of our civilization entirely. There are reasons not to despair over this. One of the reasons I hope we're going to give you today, Tim Dixon, who's the co-founder of More in Common, is doing some really interesting work in this area on polarisation and tribalism. And he's really great at not just diagnosing the problem in an evidence-based way, but offering actual possibilities for how we might get out of that mess.
Yes, Tim, who's a former speechwriter and economic advisor to two Australian Prime Ministers, among a whole lot of other things he's done, has been here in Australia for CPX doing the Richard Johnson lecture in Sydney and Melbourne. His topic, Crossing the Great Divide, Building Bridges in an Age of Tribalism, seemed especially relevant for this moment. And he came into CPX during his visit to chat about his work. So Tim, thanks for being here. It's great to have you back.
Thank you, Simon. Great to be here.
Now, the organisation that you co-founded in 2017, More in Common, is already busy and thriving. It's doing great work. Tell us a little bit about how it came about.
Well, it's a combination of a kind of making sense of what's happening in the world and also some personal tragedy. The larger piece is that there's a lot that's going wrong around us and a lot of disruption, and we started doing some work to understand what was driving a lot of the anti-refugee, anti-immigration sort of attitudes that were driving the rise of the far right and the disruption of political systems in Europe especially, And it felt like we're not going to handle this the way that we did, the boat people in the 70s, for example, which we always look back on and see as a success, in subsequent years.
Well, there's a much bigger welcome of boat people in Australia, at least.
Far bigger, exactly. So that was one part of it. But then in the middle of, while we were working on those issues, a good friend of mine, Joe Cox, the British Labor MP, who had been a champion of another project that was related to Syria, people in Syria and the rights of the sort of the democratic movement within Syria. Joe was a champion of all those issues and refugee issues and other things in Parliament in Britain, and she was suddenly, in her own electorate in Yorkshire, was killed by a far-right extremist. And, I'd literally sat at the table with Jo on the houseboat she and Brendan live on, and we would scroll through Facebook and she'd be getting death threats, as many women in public life, politics do get. And she'd kind of laugh it off and never took it that seriously. And when that happened to Jo, and it seemed a very random act, but at the same time it seemed to say something much larger about the way in which people are being pushed to the edge and the way in which we're navigating debates and issues, whether it's a Brexit or a Trump or any number of issues in our public life. It's changed. We're not managing these issues well, as we're not managing difference well. And there's something about the glue in our society that's becoming unstuck. And trying to get to the bottom of that and realising that we're much more quickly moving into a period of crisis than we'd anticipated. That's the motivation for More in Common.
So that's fascinating in this sort of bigger picture sense, which you're always tuned into, but then a very personal kind of stab, isn't it? That brings all of those sort of things that might at one level sound theoretical, but then that brings it home.
And it was such it was a very, very strange experience. I still can't quite make sense of it, because there I was, an Australian who had been living several years in New York. I'd moved to London before that. But I was suddenly catapulted into this sort of moment of a national tragedy. But also, the thing about Jo, which is hard to convey, is she's an incredibly positive person. So when 5 of us who were close friends the next day were sitting around talking and just, obviously feeling utterly gutted, we looked at each other and realised Jo would not let us sit here and be miserable. She's such a relentlessly positive person. She would want us to make something of it. So we created a crowdfunder, and we raised, in the end, £2 million, $4 million through that in a matter of days. The country just came around in response to this horrific tragedy. There was this real sense of, we can't let things like this pull us apart. And it was fascinating to watch how, the politicians of the Conservative Party, the governing party against this Labor Party, were just fantastic in the way they came together. And personally, so generous, so warm. You saw the things which were bigger than the political sort of tribalism. But the country also came together. We had, and that was a significant moment to be thrown in, to see both the worst and the best of what we can be side by side.
That seems to be a bit of a pattern to me.
It is. I reflect on this in the context of the difference between the process that Germany as a country and Germans have been through in reflecting on the trauma of the Nazi era and the Second World War, and how it has created guardrails in that society and a lot greater sensitivity to the vulnerable, to the refugee crisis, of course, is where this has really been highlighted. But there's a sort of a conscientiousness about the question of what is right for a society to do that you see that is amongst Germans, that is a legacy of that horrific Nazi period. And that has made me, being close to that in the last few years, has made me think about exactly that. It is, out of terrible catastrophe, good things can come. In a sense, as a Christian, I think of that in the context of the resurrection. There is something about that, something about the second chance, the renewal, the fact that we're not always stuck in the story that we seem to be a part of.
Let's talk a bit about More in Common, what it does and why.
We work in 4 countries, the 4 of the largest Western democracies, the United States, United Kingdom, France and Germany. We are focused on the understanding and addressing the forces that are driving us apart, that are driving our societies apart, that are polarising us, weakening our democracy, threatening us. And our work is to get to the bottom of that. We do a lot of essentially sort of public opinion, social psychology work, qualitative research. We're finding out what's happening. We're not interested so much what's happening on the stage, the big leader, the Trump speech, the spectacular, the stuff that's on our screens all the time. We're actually focused what's happening among people, which often means exactly. And in a sense, you turn the camera around from the populist figurehead on the stage, turn around to the people. Why are they reacting in this moment? Why are our societies becoming so fractured? That's the thing that we do a lot of work to understand and then find solutions. So we're looking at what's the glue that can bring us back together? What are the connections across these lines, these fractured lines? And so as an example, we have got a lot of insight about, we talk about the middle populations, the people who are sort of drawn this way and drawn that way. And they are the majority in most countries. We talk about them as the exhausted majority.
Yes.
And we try to understand their values, their concerns, how they're experiencing life. And, so as a practical example, we have a very close partnership with the Catholic Church in France. Catholic identity is a really important part of French identity, and it's kind of torn this way and that way around the issues that are dividing the French around the Islamic community, Muslim community, the failures of integration of migrants into their society, and many other pieces that are affecting French society today. And they're drawn both towards a sort of traditionalism that says we have to fight for an exclusionary French identity, and towards the welcoming the stranger, the openness, the connection with people. And the work that we've done is helping them to find ways to communicate core Christian values, Catholic values, in ways that connect with those people in this exhausted majority. And it's translating to a whole lot of training programs, to resources, etc. And they're seeing real results from doing that. So that's an example. We're sort of bringing an expertise to that. But similarly, looking at a whole bunch of partnerships, civil society, might be government, localised levels. How do we talk about these issues of difference in ways that break down, that create opportunity for connection, break down these differences? How do we connect people? How do we think of the way in which we're living today when we're in our echo chambers and we're living in our sort of bubbles and just hanging out with people like us? And what are the solutions to that? So we're a combination of quite big picture, but then also quite micro in trying to find where things are working and how do we scale those things up.
What are some of the ways in which the sort of work you're doing might lead to some better things? Where's the hope in this work?
Part of the challenge that we're facing is that there is a lot of things that we in sort of educated, more smaller, liberal, cosmopolitan society, there's a lot of things that we're doing that make things worse. And we could stop doing those things. So, for example, when people feel very insecure and threatened by change at multiple levels, as they do now, it is a natural human impulse for us to retreat to a narrower sense of who's on my side, a sort of in-group versus out-group, us versus them. And that's what's being exploited by populists who want to come along and tell you there's this threat to you, these people are against you, you have to sort of, I will protect you, come around me, and if you understand the anxiety that drives that and that sense of the need for belonging, you can answer that need for belonging. To do that, you have to speak to where people are at and speak to that need for a sense of identity and purpose and so forth. And this is where, in our work, it takes us to being convinced that we need to talk about our national identity, not just talk about the tribal identities of particular groups within the community, but a bigger story of us as a whole society, who we are, which typically is primarily going to be around national identity. That's what people mostly relate to. So we talk about this as inclusive patriotism, a bigger story of us. Now, the remarkable thing is, when we've tested it, it basically always wins. It always appeals to people. People want that. I actually think President Obama was extraordinarily skilled. It was an improbable presidency, but he got there because he told a bigger story of us. He didn't play a hostile racial politics. He played an inclusive racial politics, and in a very sophisticated way, and catapulted himself into the leadership of the free world. And I think that you can see that not just in the political sense, but at many levels. If we try to think when we're shaping a group and shaping a story and shaping an identity, how do we make this a story that all of us are a part of? It is powerful. It addresses this need for belonging and identity that people deeply feel that we must not ignore, but it does it in a way that doesn't appeal to the us versus them division, but to a bigger story of us.
In that sense, is tribalism in that context a good thing? Like us, we identify as a particular group, but as you say, it's an inclusive, generous us.
Absolutely. So a big story of us says, you know why we don't leave people for years on an offshore island, they're effectively to rot away, is because that's not the kind of people we want to be as Australians. We know that we're very privileged, we've been blessed with a lot, but we want to be people who demonstrate a welcoming spirit, who demonstrate a sense of generosity. And so it's a story, therefore, you're talking about character, you're talking about identity, you're talking about who we are, rather than just disembodied principles. And I think that matters. That changes the nature of a conversation around issues of us versus them. So yes, don't go into the kind of globalism of we're all just global citizens, because that doesn't communicate to more than 2/3 of the population. Have a story of us, but make it one that is inclusive.
This is Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. Tim Dixon was a speechwriter and economic advisor to 2 Australian Prime Ministers. The organisation that he co-founded, More in Common, they're doing some of the most sought-after research on all this. The report that they've just published, it's called Hidden Tribes, and it maps the polarised landscape of the US. It's been written up by everyone from The Atlantic to Vox to The New Yorker. This is a big deal.
Yeah, and one of the reasons this work is so valuable is it's not just diagnosis or analysis of the problem, it actually offers solutions. Now, Tim Dixon thinks that faith communities have a role to play here. Sometimes religious differences fuel polarisation, of course, but there's potential for something far more positive. Tim, I wonder how much the erosion of community life and the sort of divisions within communities has been brought on by a loss of faith in institutions, not only the church, but including the church.
Well, I think there's two factors there. There is the institutions that we turn to resolve our difficulties, big problems, to solve things. They have let us down. So whether you think about the big financial institutions, you've had the Royal Commission, in the last few years, whether you think about the institutions that were meant to protect the most vulnerable people in society, churches, the institutional abuse, all of those stories, where you think about government, where we're constantly hearing these stories that just appear to be a kind of something close to corruption of the government contracts and all those sorts of things. So there's all of that happening, which means the institutions that we've once trusted seem to no longer live up to the standards that we expect of them. And some of that is just because we're a lot more transparent. So some of these things have probably been going on for a very long period of time, but they're much more out in the open. But the other side of it that I think is eroding the kind of community life is just how we live our lives. For example, your street is now much less likely today to have a variety of income levels, or sort of rich and poor, than say it was maybe 50 years ago, 80 years ago, 100 years ago. You get less diversity of different ideologies, different values, different parts of the community. We're more separated, we're more siloed. Housing prices especially are doing that, but also some of the biggest splits in our society now are between the the sort of well-off cosmopolitan cities, highly educated people with sort of professional jobs, etc., and then the peripheries of those cities and the regional areas. So when you have less diversity in the community silo-wise, you have less exposure to difference. That's dangerous. I mean, it breaks down, the heart of community life is exposure to people who are not like you. And once we had a lot more at many different levels of community life, and in the world we live in now, a lot less. And I think that's feeding this tribalism, because it's much easier to hold very hostile, prejudicial views of other people if you actually don't know them personally.
I think at its best, the church can counteract that kind of thing. What does it do really well in terms of that connection between people who otherwise might be considered very different from each other?
Well, I mean, what's unique as a social institution or a sort of a community organisation is that it's in the values of Christian faith that a church, in a church context, that you love people who are very different from you. It's one of the rare contexts in modern life where you get a full range of different ages and backgrounds. So, I mean, I come back to the church that I attended living in Sydney, C3 at Ryde, 1,000 people there, 45 different nationalities. Didn't exist 20 years ago. Now its makeup is probably about half Caucasian and half not. I mean, it is a reflection of its community. People come together to worship. They celebrate once a year. There's a celebration, International Day. People, all kinds of backgrounds, tell the stories of what it means to come from the culture they come. There's refugees there. There's community work. There's engagement with the schools. It's a healthy, vibrant community or church that is part of its community and that's not hostile to it, but it is actually sort of warmly engaged with it. And I think there is a lot that I can say about how religious forces can be forces of division in societies, but we're probably more familiar with those examples. There's also a lot that is happening in the kind of the exhausted majority of our societies, which is actually still working well.
Are there things within Christian theology that are particular to this in terms of energising community across differences?
I think it's both a Jewish and Christian principle of welcoming the stranger. That is, the widow, the orphan, the stranger is echoes all the way through the Hebrew scriptures, and I think it's quite striking. I mean, I have my own journey in terms of my faith journey. I have sort of been everywhere except for Catholic churches. And so it's been an interesting experience for me spending time in continental Europe and seeing how deeply in Italy and in France actually as well, the Catholic values of inclusion and welcome really are reflected in local communities and in how local communities have responded to the refugee crisis. In fact, I've done a lot of work in the last few years on the expansion of sponsorship of refugees, community sponsorship, which is a Canadian policy. 400,000 refugees in the last 40 years have been fostered basically through kind of local community organisations, and that policy is now being spread around the world. And it's really striking how often, I mean, the vast majority of cases all around the world, it's actually faith organisations, faith communities that do that work of welcome. So I think that is it's a core element. I think there's other elements. I without getting too theological with you, I think that the nature of the Trinity, the revelation of Trinitarian theology, is all about God revealed as a relationship between three persons. That is to say that if we talk about the idea of humans being created in the image of God, but what that means, if God is a relationship between three persons, then the most fundamental thing about being human is our relationships, our connection to others. Now, last month I picked up a terrific book by a friend of mine, Johann Hari, called Lost Connections. Fantastic book about the nature of depression. Now, Johann, is absolutely the most secular guy that you'll find, and he would wince when I say this to him. But his book is Trinitarian theology to me. He's talking about how pharmaceutical treatments for depression have quite a limited impact for the majority of people who experience depressive illness, and he talks about the strong scientific evidence for us losing our connection with each other, with meaningful work, with our own trauma in our own lives, and that re-establishing those connections is powerful in addressing issues of mental health. But an element of that to me is just living out an understanding of Trinitarian theology. And in a sense, you could take that straight from a reading of Scripture. Without the last 30 years of fantastic sort of social psychology, which teaches you a lot of those insights.
Now, Jesus didn't seem to be into social cohesion. He caused a lot of division, didn't he? Does he have anything to say about this conversation?
Well, I mean, look, the vision of Revelation 7 is every tongue, every tribe, every nation coming together. Pentecost, the first sort of big incident following Jesus' resurrection, is a story of people from all sorts of backgrounds who, couldn't even communicate together, suddenly having the capacity to communicate. So I think that this story of transcending differences and of being brought together, the reconciliation of differences is actually absolutely at the heart of Christian faith, which is why, for me, I think it's incomprehensible that Christian faith is used to divide and to kind of create the in-group and out-group elements.
It is,
because
it
is completely. And I mean, look, my background when I first came to faith in my teenage years, I was subsequently in a super, super conservative church that absolutely did that kind of, in-out thing all the time with people. So, yes, I've totally seen that all through my life. But I would also say that you can, some of the most hopeful places all around the world you see are these places where people are living out something that's much, much truer to the faith.
Were we actually better at this stuff in the past, or is this just nostalgia?
I think that each generation, each time, faces a different set of challenges. So I think that we had huge difficulties making the transition from being an agricultural society to being an industrial society. I mean, you read the conditions in the kind of Dickensian era, for example, the time of John Wesley, where social fragmentation, I mean, it was a chaotic and near collapse of society. I mean, in a sense, that's where Australia was born from, right? Like sort of getting all these petty criminals off, which are petty criminals, is largely a reflection of a kind of social collapse. And things changed and they made their way through that. I think that similarly, we are in a period of big transition. I suspect that, I mean, let's imagine we were in 1908 and we were having a conversation about what's going on in the world, and I might have a positive view and you might have a negative view. But if we were to listen to that conversation, 110 or so years after, the only thing we would hear about it is like, well, these guys are having a conversation 6 years before the world kind of blew itself up in the First World War. That is to say that we interpret that whole period through the lens of what subsequently happened. I suspect we are living in a similar period now. We are living in a pre-something period. I am concerned that pre-thing is leading into something that may not be good at all. The forces of fracturing that are driving us apart are growing. They're intensifying. If we don't pay serious attention to how we bring people back together and transcend these divisions, if we continue to play the kind of toxic politics that has been characteristic of the last few years, I think we're headed in a very, very dangerous direction. But on the other hand, you can, go back to that example of the Industrial Revolution era. You can also have that spontaneous uprising of social movements, the Methodist revival, the rise of the trade union movement, closely related developments, incidentally, the kind of creation of a whole lot of grassroots changes and also reforms that happened at the government level, and actually, slowly but gradually, a better and fairer society and social progress was achieved. So, look, it's a choice. Technology doesn't need to divide us. It's doing that right now. We've allowed that to happen. We have choices. We shouldn't feel disempowered. And some of the biggest changes can actually start from within the context of our local communities.
You strike me as concerned, but yet somehow optimistic. Bottom line is, how do we work towards a more unified, cohesive, healthy society?
I think we have to really consciously think about how we counter these forces that are dividing us, and make it a priority that we create a bigger tent, that we think of the people who are being left out of a conversation, of culture, of policy, of the stories we're telling ourselves. So I like, for example, Gabrielle Chan, the journalist who's recently been writing a lot about the lives of Australians in rural, regional, forgotten areas, because we have just not been hearing those voices and their experiences. And, it's a critically important part of Australia as a nation. We need those kinds of voices to be elevated. I think that's the thing. It's to the bigger tent, bringing people in, creating, checking ourselves, and when we think that we're right and somebody else is wrong, and trying to hear the other side and push ourselves outside of our own bubbles.
That's Tim Dixon, and this is Life and Faith.
Tim co-founded More in Common in 2017. If this is your thing, then you should definitely go and spend some time on their website. Tim was back home in Australia to give CPX's 6th annual Richard Johnson lecture. It was called Crossing the Great Divide, Building Bridges in an Age of Tribalism. You can listen to that lecture online. It's now available. Go to the CPX website, publicchristianity.org, to check it out.
If you've enjoyed this conversation, please tell your friends about Life and Faith and maybe leave us a rating or review. It helps spread the word.
Next week, we talk Tolkien, dragons and fairies, among other things, with Alison Milbank.
I think we desire the world to be deeper and more exciting than it is. I mean, I love unicorns. I don't love the kind of cosy little unicorns that are soft toys. For me, unicorns are powerful and represent a kind of the power of sort of young women in a kind of almost supernatural way. And similarly, dragons, it's a much more exciting world if there are things like dragons, things that surprise us, things sort of monsters on the edge of existence.